How much for the scrap metal?
50 credits, no less. I'll give you 30.
Nobody stopped. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Thousands of people walked through the Veth market on Kuro Station every single day. Merchants, traders, tourists, diplomats, beings from 47 different species, all going about their business, all pretending they didn't see her. A woman, chained to a post, a sign hanging around her neck that read one single word, free, and nobody stopped. Nobody, until Sergeant Dara Kale did. Stay with me, because this story goes somewhere you won't expect. We're going to talk about what happened the moment Dara stopped, and why that one decision changed the fate of an entire civilization. We're going to talk about what the woman in those chains actually was, and why every single species on that station was terrified of her. And we're going to talk about what humanity's place in this galaxy actually means. Not the version the politicians sell you, but the real version. The one written in moments like this one. All right, let's go back to the beginning. Kuro Station floated at the edge of the Veth corridor, one of those places the galaxy uses as a couch cushion. A place where things get lost, forgotten, or deliberately hidden. It wasn't glamorous. The air recyclers hadn't been properly maintained in 6 years, which meant the whole station smelled like recycled copper and something that might have been fish, or might have been an entirely different biological process that we don't have a word for. The lighting flickered in the market district because the central power node had been patched 17 times. And nobody wanted to spend the credits to replace it properly. It was, in every way, the kind of place where inconvenient things were made to disappear. Sergeant Dara Kale had been stationed on Kuros for 8 months as part of a Terran diplomatic security rotation. She was 31 years old, originally from a coastal town in what used to be Portugal on Earth. And she had, by her own admission, seen some things in her career that permanently rewired certain parts of her brain. War does that. You know what you've seen. You learn to file things away in locked drawers in your mind, and you get very good at not opening them. But Dara had one rule she'd carried with her since she was 7 years old. Standing in her grandmother's kitchen, listening to a story about a different kind of market, in a different era, on a different continent. She never walked past someone who needed help. That was it. That was the whole rule. It sounds simple. Most real things do. Now, before I tell you what she did, you need to understand what everyone else on that station understood. You need to understand why they kept walking. Because this isn't a story about monsters. It's a story about fear. And how humans process fear differently than almost every other species in this galaxy. The Veth market was busy that morning. 3 cargo haulers had docked overnight, which always pushed the market into a kind of controlled chaos. Traders trying to offload goods before customs checks, locals trying to get first access to imports, and the usual ecosystem of beings who operated in the margins. The woman was chained at the east end of the market, near the water reclamation pillar. The big ugly one that everyone used as a landmark. She was Vihari. If you don't know what a Vihari looks like, here's your quick primer. Taller than a human by about 30 centimeters, with skin that shifted between deep violet and a kind of silver gray, depending on their mood or temperature. 4 eyes, 2 primary, 2 smaller auxiliary ones set just above the temples. Elongated fingers, 12 of them, which moved constantly in small patterns that served as a secondary communication channel in their culture. Beautiful, in an entirely alien way, and terrifying to everyone else on that station, for a reason that had nothing to do with how they looked. The Vihari were telepaths. Not the soft, fuzzy kind you see in hollows where someone touches your hand and gets a vague impression. Full, deep, involuntary broadcast telepaths. A Vihari in emotional distress could project their internal state to every being within 40 meters. And not just as a feeling, as a full sensory experience. The Keth, a species that communicated primarily through scent, had a documented physiological crisis response when exposed to Vihari emotional projection. Their scent glands would lock, which in their biology was the equivalent of losing the ability to breathe properly. The Dulhari, a species with photosensitive skin, would experience the projection as blinding light bursts that could cause temporary retinal damage. Even humans, who had the most neurologically buffered response of any documented species, reported intense anxiety, involuntary memory recall, and in some cases, mild auditory hallucinations. Vihari were, involuntarily, living weapons of psychological warfare. This was not their fault. This was their biology. And this is why an entire market of beings walked past a chained woman and pretended she didn't exist. Because getting close to her meant feeling whatever she was feeling. And whatever she was feeling right now, judging by the faint shimmer in the air around her that indicated active projection, nobody wanted to experience. But here's what nobody in that market understood. Here's the thing that makes this story worth telling in the truest possible sense. Dara had already been feeling it for 2 minutes before she stopped. She'd walked into the projection field without realizing it. The shimmer of anxiety, the low background hum of shame and exhaustion, she'd felt it. She'd filed it. She'd kept walking. And then, 3 stalls past the water reclamation pillar, she stopped. Because she recognized it. She'd felt that exact texture of emotion before. Not from an alien, from herself. 7 years ago in a field hospital on the Martian corridor, after a mission that went wrong in ways she still didn't fully talk about. That specific flavor of exhausted despair, of someone who had given up on being seen. Dara Kale turned around and walked back. She didn't do it dramatically. She didn't announce herself. She walked up to the woman as if this were the most normal thing in the world, crouched down to eye level, because the woman was sitting, her back against the water reclamation pillar, chains looped through an anchor ring in the base, and said, "Hey, you doing okay?" In Galactic Standard, because Dara's Vihari was basically non-existent. The woman looked at her, all 4 eyes. The projection spiked. Dara felt it like a fist around her sternum. Shock, disbelief, a violent flare of hope immediately tamped down by something that had learned not to hope, because hope had been disappointed too many times. Dara breathed through it. "I'm Sergeant Kale, Terran Diplomatic Security. I'm going to need to understand what's happening here before I do anything. But I want you to know I'm not walking away. Okay? I'm not walking away." The woman's finger patterns shifted. Dara didn't know what they meant, but she pulled out her translation unit anyway and held it up. The unit beeped twice. Uncertain signal. The Vihari's finger language was a secondary dialect that the standard units weren't great at parsing. Dara put the unit away. She sat down on the ground next to the woman, crossed her legs, and said, "All right, we'll figure it out." The projection that came off the woman in that moment was something Dara would later describe in her official report as intense enough to require a moment of personal composure. In the medical report filed by the station's Terran physician, the equivalent emotional content was recorded as complete and total disbelief that anyone had sat down. Dara didn't know it yet, but sitting down next to that woman was the opening move in what would become the largest diplomatic incident in Terran history. She didn't know that the woman's name was Velasha Ray, that she was not a random vagrant, not a criminal, not a slave sold into someone's strange collection. She was the last surviving member of the Vihari Royal Science Caste. And the people who chained her there, the people who wrote that sign, were not random traffickers. They were waiting, watching, and they had just made a very serious mistake because they hadn't counted on a human sitting down. It took 11 minutes. Dara had been sitting with Velasha Ray for 11 minutes, working through the translation gap the slow way, pointing at things, watching the woman's finger patterns for reactions, piecing together context. When 3 figures pushed through the market crowd and stopped in front of them. Grathcore Syndicate. If you know anything about the outer station networks in the Veth corridor, you know the name. If you don't, short version. They were a criminal organization with just enough legitimate business licenses to make them complicated to arrest, and just enough political connections to make them dangerous to annoy. They operated in what they called asset management. Everyone else called it what it was. The one in front, a Dolhari male, heavy set, wearing the kind of expensive coat that people wear to communicate that they've done enough bad things to afford it, looked down at Dara with a particular expression of someone who has never been inconvenienced by someone like her before. "Human," he said. "This asset is under syndicate custody pending sale. Move away." Dara looked up at him. She had a very specific face she made in moments like this. Her colleagues called it the paperwork face. It meant, "I am about to make your life so procedurally complicated that you will wish you had never been born." "Asset," Dara said very calmly. "That's an interesting word for a person. She is not your concern. She is now." Dara stood up. She was not particularly tall, 170 centimeters, but she had a way of occupying space that people twice her size sometimes found uncomfortable. "Sergeant Dara Kale, Terran Diplomatic Security, badge number 7, Tango Foxtrot 219. I'm going to need to see your documentation for this individual. Full chain of custody, sale authorization under Veth corridor statutes, and your syndicate operating license for this station. Can you get that for me?" The Dolhari male stared at her. "Now," Dara added pleasantly, "here's the thing about human bureaucratic patience that most species in the galaxy still haven't fully reckoned with. We are, as a species, extraordinarily good at weaponizing paperwork. This is not in any of the galactic species guides. The Vihari entry on humans talks about our creativity, our emotional volatility, our unusual capacity for endurance. The Dolhari entry mentions our aggression potential and our pack bonding instincts. Nobody mentions that humans invented bureaucracy as a load-bearing civilizational structure, that we have practiced it for 6,000 years, and that a trained human security officer in a documentation dispute is one of the most terrifying natural phenomena in the explored galaxy." Dara Kale was about to demonstrate why. The Dolhari produced a data chip, standard syndicate custody paperwork. He clearly expected Dara to glance at it, find it technically sufficient, and back down. Dara read it, all of it, slowly. She had a small scanning tool in her jacket pocket that she ran over every data signature. "This chain of custody references a sale authorization from Kuros Station's commodities office," she said. "But Kuros Station reclassified its commodities office under the Veth Accord revision 14 months ago, which means this authorization template is from a regulatory framework that no longer applies. You'll need a new authorization under the revised framework. I can point you to the office. It's in the administrative ring, Section 7C. They open in about 3 hours." Silence. Also, Dara continued. This individual is listed here as species classification non-sapient entity, class 4. But Vihari are a recognized sapient species under Terran treaty law, which Kuro Station is a signatory to. I'm not sure that classification holds up. I'm going to need to make a call to the station's legal office to clarify. More silence. And, Dara said, I noticed this authorization was signed by a station port authority officer, one Magistrate Velken, who I happen to know retired 8 months ago. So this signature is either forged or was backdated, and either way that's a problem. The Dulhari male's eye membranes flickered. That was the Dulhari equivalent of a very controlled attempt not to show panic. Human, he said, you do not understand the situation. Probably not, Dara agreed. Help me understand it. We can do this right here. What happened next was the part Dara would later describe as the moment it got interesting. One of the other 2 syndicate members, a Keth female who had been hanging back, stepped forward and said, quietly and precisely, Sergeant Kale, the Vihari you're sitting with is Velasha Ray of the 1st Science Cast. You may know the name. Her government officially declared her dead 11 months ago. Dead people have no standing under any treaty framework. Whatever you think you're doing here, you are protecting someone who does not exist. Dara looked at the woman, at Velasha Ray, who was watching her with all 4 eyes, whose finger patterns were doing something complex and fast that Dara still couldn't read, whose projection, quietly, underneath everything, was doing something Dara hadn't felt from her before. Something that felt, unmistakably, like the very specific emotion of, they know. They're going to use it. This is the part where it ends. Dara filed that away. Interesting, she said. I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me. She pulled out her comm unit. I'm going to make that call to the station legal office now. While we wait, nobody's going anywhere because we're in the middle of a documentation dispute and everyone involved needs to remain available. Station security regulations, subsection 4, paragraph 11. I can quote it if you'd like. The syndicate didn't leave. They couldn't, without making the documentation dispute official in a way that would create records they didn't want. And Dara had been very precise about making sure the conversation was logged. Her comm unit had been recording since the moment she stood up. She had them in a hold. Not forever, not even for long, but for right now. And right now was all she needed. Because while she was on the comm to the legal office, asking complicated questions about the Veth Accord revision in a tone that suggested she had all the time in the world, she was also, with her other hand low and out of sight, tapping a coded message on the back of her comm unit. Emergency contact. Human diplomatic channels. Priority 1. Subject line. Active sapient trafficking. Possible diplomatic incident. Requesting backup and a specific file pull. The file she requested was the Vihari Royal Science Cast personnel records from 6 years ago. She wanted to know what Velasha Ray had been working on before someone decided she needed to be declared dead. The answer, when it came back 22 minutes later, was the thing that changed everything. The file came in at 0947 station time, tagged Priority Diplomatic and encrypted to Dara's personal biometrics. She read it in 3 minutes while maintaining a running conversation with the station legal office about regulatory frameworks. This is what it said. Vel Asha Ray, designation REI 7 Alpha, was the lead researcher on the Vihari Crown Project, a classified research initiative that had been running for 9 years before her disappearance. The project's official designation was Resonance Mapping. Its unofficial summary, translated from Vihari scientific notation, a map of every inhabited system in the explored galaxy, cross-referenced with deep space gravitational resonance data designed to predict stellar events, supernovas, gamma-ray bursts, solar flares, up to 40 years in advance. Dara stopped tapping her bureaucratic answers for approximately 2 seconds. Then she started again. 40 years of advance warning on stellar events. You understand what that means, right? Let me be very specific because this matters. There are 11 inhabited systems in the Veth corridor alone that sit within the estimated event horizon of stars classified as elevated instability by galactic astronomical surveys. Billions of beings, 12 inhabited planets, 37 station clusters. Those surveys are accurate to within roughly a 20-year window. Which sounds okay until you think about the logistics of evacuating billions of people. You need more than a 20-year window. You need infrastructure build-out. You need political will. You need the kind of lead time that lets you move entire civilizations without panic and collapse. 40 years gives you that. Vel-Asha Ray had been working on the tool that could give billions of beings a fighting chance, and someone had declared her dead and chained her to a market post with a sign that read, "Free." Now we need to talk about who did this. Because this is where the story gets dark in a way that I want you to sit with. It wasn't random criminals who decided to sell a scientist. The Grathcore Syndicate, as Dara's file pull revealed over the next hour, wasn't acting independently. They were the middlemen, the actual client, the entity that had paid to have Vel-Asha Ray extracted from Bahari space, transported to Kuros Station and placed in limbo, was a corporate consortium. 7 companies, spread across 4 species, territories, all with significant energy infrastructure holdings. They built power systems. They maintained star-adjacent collection arrays. They profited enormously from the current model of galactic energy distribution, a model that depended, critically, on stars behaving in ways that nobody could predict more than a decade out, which meant every energy contract was perpetually short-term, perpetually renewed, perpetually profitable. A 40-year stellar prediction map would fundamentally restructure galactic energy markets. It would also allow planetary governments to plan long-term, which meant they'd stop buying short-term emergency energy contracts at monopoly prices. The consortium stood to lose, conservatively, trillions. So they'd done what people with trillions do when something threatens them. They'd made the problem disappear. The sign said, "Free," because selling her was too risky. Too many records, too much traceability. They'd intended to let her sit there until she died from exposure, or until someone moved her to one of the station's holding cells for vagrancy. Stateless, non-existent, a body with no paperwork, which in most of the galaxy means a body with no rights. Dara read this file. She looked at Vel-Asha Ray, who was still sitting next to her, chains still on, watching Dara read with an expression that had shifted over the past hour from exhausted despair to something more complicated, more watchful. Dara put down the comm unit. She looked at the Dolhari male, who was still standing there, flanked by his 2 colleagues, increasingly uncomfortable. She said very quietly, "I need you to remove those chains. Human, I'm not asking about documentation anymore. I'm not asking about regulatory frameworks. I'm looking at you as one being to another, and I'm telling you to take those chains off her. Now." The Dolhari male's coat, Dara had noticed, was expensive. The kind of expensive that people who've had a very bad past wear to remind themselves they've escaped it. She looked him in the eye. "You know what she is," Dara said. "You know what they had her working on. You know what happens to beings who end up in situations like hers. I think somewhere under that coat, You know exactly what kind of people you're working for. And I think you know that what they're planning to do, not just to her, but to all the systems that could have been warned, is not something you can unknow. Silence. Take them off, Dara said. And then you're going to help me. What happened next is documented. There are records, official logs, 12 witness statements, and a particularly interesting piece of security footage from the water reclamation pillar's maintenance camera that shows exactly what a human being looks like when they're running on nothing but principle and coffee, and the absolute refusal to accept that things are the way they are. But before I tell you the next part, I want to stop and say something directly. This story is not really about one woman making a brave choice. It's about what happens when you combine a species that feels the emotions of everyone around them, that can't escape the emotional reality of their situation, with a species that has, apparently, developed the specific evolutionary trait of sitting down next to suffering and refusing to leave. Vihari were terrifying to every other species because they broadcast, they projected, involuntarily. Whatever they were feeling became your experience, and every species in that market had spent their lives learning to keep a safe distance from that. Because it was uncomfortable. Because feeling someone else's pain is hard, and they had their own problems, and they didn't ask to feel it, and it wasn't their responsibility. Humans didn't have that response. Not because we're braver, not because we're better. Because we grew up on a planet where we couldn't escape each other's pain. We lived in tribes, in villages, in cities, packed together, making noise together, bleeding together. Our nervous systems were already wired for contact, for resonance, for the unbearable proximity of other people's suffering. A Vihari projecting distress at 40 meters was not comfortable for Dara. But it was familiar. It was recognizable. And she'd learned, from her grandmother, from her training, from 7 years of doing this job. That recognizable is somewhere to start. The Dulhari male's name, Dara would later learn, was Vek Oratur. He had a family, 2 children, a partner who thought he worked in legitimate cargo management. He'd been with the syndicate for 6 years, long enough to stop asking questions, not long enough to forget what the questions were. He removed the chains. It took him 40 seconds. His hands were shaking. Velasha Ray stood up for the first time in, Dara would learn, 31 hours. She stood at her full height, taller than Dara by that 30 centimeters, all 4 eyes open. And the projection that came off her then was something that every being within 40 meters of the water reclamation pillar later reported to the station medical office. Not distress, not fear. Something that the Dulhari Medical Registry described as resonant dignity. Something the Keth witnesses described as the smell of deep water in darkness. Something that the 3 human witnesses, including Dara, struggled to find language for. One of them wrote in their statement, "It felt like a moment I'd forgotten, like something I believed when I was a child, before I learned to stop believing it." I can't be more specific than that. Dara had 12 minutes before the syndicate's upper management started asking questions about why their field team had stopped responding. 12 minutes to move a stateless, officially dead Vihari scientist through a station where the corporate consortium had, as she now knew, at least 2 additional agents watching syndicate assets. She did not have backup yet. The Priority 1 request was being processed. She had, herself, 1 comm unit, a translation tool with a gap in Vihari finger dialect, a documentation dispute she'd manufactured, and Vek Oratur, who was now technically a witness with a very strong personal interest in the next few minutes, going well for everyone. She looked at Velasha Ray. The woman was looking back at her. Her fingers were moving in that complex pattern Dara had been trying to parse for the past hour. Dara's translation unit beeped. Uncertain signal. Dara looked at it, looked at Vel-Asha Ray, made a decision. She held out her hand, not the translation unit, just her hand. The Vihari woman looked at it. Then, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned to be very careful about what they choose to trust, she took it. The projection was immediate. Full contact amplified it. Dara felt it like a cold wave, like surfacing from very deep water. And in that sensory rush, somehow, through the not quite language of direct emotional contact, she got something. Not words, not images exactly. But she got, I know a way. If you go left, if you trust me, if you move now. Dara nodded. She looked at Vek Orator. You're coming with us, she said. Left, now. They moved. The next 9 minutes are the part of this story that the official Terran Diplomatic Security Report describes as improvised and not recommended as a procedural model going forward. Which is the most polite way they could say. Dara Kale made it up as she went, and somehow it worked. Vel-Asha Ray, it turned out, had spent 31 hours chained to that post studying the station. She couldn't leave. She could broadcast. Her projection range, when she focused it, was 60 meters. Well beyond what the station's layout required to map the foot traffic, guard rotation, and security camera blind spots of the entire market district. She was, in every sense that mattered, the best scout Dara had ever worked with. They moved through blind spots like they were following a script, past the recycling corridor, through the maintenance access point that was, according to official station maps, locked. But whose lock, Vel-Asha Ray had noticed, only engaged from the outside if someone pushed the door to a specific angle that the maintenance crew, out of habit, never did. Into the service corridor, up to level 3, across the administrative ring, to the Terran consulate office on Kuros Station, which was a modest 2-room space with a tired assistant consul named Brennan, who had been having, until that moment, an extremely boring posting. I need emergency diplomatic shelter protocol, Dara said, walking in with a freed alien scientist on one side and a nervous syndicate defector on the other. And I need you to call the ambassador. And I need coffee. In that order. Brennan stared at them. The ambassador, Dara said, is going to want to be awake for this one. What happened over the next 6 hours is the procedural part of the story. The part where lawyers and diplomats and security officers started arriving, and the situation became official and documented and complicated in all the ways that official things get complicated. But the moment that matters, the moment I want you to keep, happened before any of that. In the consulate's small waiting room, with the recycled air and the flickering light that Kuros Station couldn't seem to shake, Dara sat across from Vel-Asha Ray with a borrowed translation unit that someone had upgraded to include Vihari secondary dialect support. And Vel-Asha Ray, carefully, precisely, with the full weight of 31 hours and 11 months of something terrible, said, through the unit, why? Not a question exactly. A why with weight in it. Dara thought about it for a moment. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen. She thought about the field hospital on the Martian corridor. She thought about the texture of an emotion she'd recognized in a crowded market because it was her own. She said, "You were projecting." Vel-Asha Ray's finger patterns shifted. "What I felt?" Dara said. "Coming off you. I knew that. I recognized it. I couldn't walk past it." Through the unit. Others felt it too. They moved away. "I know," Dara said. "I'm sorry. I don't have a good answer for why I work differently." I don't know if it's cultural or biological or just... She gestured vaguely. A thing about me. But I felt it, and I knew it. And you were a person sitting in chains, and I had legs. It's not more complicated than that. A long pause. Bel-Asheray said, You did not know what I was. Not at first. You did not know about the project. Not until after. You stopped, Bel-Asheray said through the unit, before you knew any of that. Yeah, Dara said. Another long pause. The Vihari woman's projection was very quiet now. Not broadcasting. Contained. Private. And then she said something that the translation unit rendered in a flat digital voice that absolutely failed to carry the weight of it. I had stopped believing anyone would. Here's what happened next. In the version you can read in official records, Bel-Asheray was granted emergency diplomatic asylum by the Terran government within 48 hours. The Vihari government's official position that she was dead created a complicated legal situation that took 11 months to fully resolve, during which she was technically the guest of the Terran consulate on New Geneva Station, which was a significant upgrade from a market post. Vec Ora Tour's testimony about the Grath Corps Syndicate and the corporate consortium was provided in exchange for a reduced charge agreement that the Terran legal team negotiated on his behalf. He went home to his family. His partner, when told what he'd actually been doing for 6 years, was apparently furious. And then, apparently, not. The details are not in the official record, but were relayed to Dara by Vec Ora Tour in a personal message 2 years later, which she described only as something that made me cry on a Tuesday morning, which is the best kind of thing. The corporate consortium's 7-member companies were investigated by a multi-species trade commission. 3 were dissolved. 4 were restructured under new management. The investigations took 4 years and resulted in regulatory changes across 3 treaty frameworks that made this specific flavor of academic suppression, declaring a researcher legally dead to neutralize their work. A recognized and specifically prosecutable crime under Veth corridor law. This is not a small thing. This is the kind of policy change that usually takes 20 years and a lot of people failing to make it happen. It took 4 because someone had the paperwork to make it stick. The resonance mapping project was completed, not by Bel-Asheray alone. She'd lost 11 months of work, and some of her notes had been deliberately corrupted by whoever extracted her files before her disappearance. But with resources from the Terran Science Directorate, collaboration from 3 other species astronomical institutes who had been working on adjacent problems, and 18 months of work that Bel-Asheray described in interviews as the most difficult and the most meaningful of my life, the map was finished. The first public version was released 14 months after completion. It identified 6 inhabited systems with high-confidence stellar events within a 30-year window. 6 systems, billions of beings, with 30 years of lead time to do something about it. The galactic response was complicated and slow and imperfect, because that's how galactic responses work. But it happened. And it happened because a woman was still alive to make it happen. Now here's the part I want to leave you with. Because I want to be precise about what this story actually means. It's not that humans are better. It's not that we're braver or stronger or smarter. It's that we evolved on a noisy, crowded, chaotic planet where we couldn't get away from each other. Where we learned, through necessity, not virtue, to stand the proximity of other people's pain. Where we built the entire structure of our civilization on the assumption that the person next to you is a person. That's not a superpower. It's barely even a skill. It's just a habit at this point. a very old, very ingrained habit. But in a galaxy where fear of contact is the survival strategy, where keeping a safe emotional distance is the rational choice, a species with a 30,000-year habit of sitting down next to suffering is apparently remarkable. The Vihari have a word, in their secondary finger dialect, that was later explained to Dara by Velasha Ray in a long, careful conversation about language. There's no exact translation, but the closest approximation in galactic standard is something like the one who does not flinch from resonance. It's an honorific, very old, reserved in Vihari culture for specific individuals across their history. Beings who, when confronted with the full broadcast of another's pain, did not look away. The word predates their first contact with humanity by 4,000 years. They had the word ready. They were just waiting to use it. Velasha Ray used it for the first time in 1,200 years. She used it for a sergeant from a coastal town in Portugal who had one rule and a paperwork face and could recognize the specific texture of exhausted despair because she'd felt it herself once in a field hospital and had learned, slowly, imperfectly, at significant personal cost, not to be afraid of it. Dara Kale retired from Terran diplomatic security 6 years after the incident on Purrs Station. She now teaches at the Terran Interspecies Relations Academy on Earth. One of her students, on the first day of every course she teaches, asks the same question that first-day students always ask. What's the most important thing in interspecies diplomacy? Dara always gives the same answer. She says, show up, and then don't leave. The students always laugh a little because it sounds like a joke. It isn't a joke. Velasha Ray, at the last count I can find in public record, has been cited in the academic literature on stellar prediction modeling 4,017 times. She is apparently, by all accounts, a generous collaborator, a demanding mentor, and, in specific circumstances that she does not advertise widely but that are fairly well known in the right circles, willing to project full emotional broadcast for human researchers who ask nicely, as a research tool, to help them understand emotional states they have no other framework for. Several of those researchers have reported the experience as the most profound of their professional lives. One described it in a paper as the sensation of being completely understood by something older and larger than yourself, and finding, to your surprise, that it is not frightening. That's the story of the woman in the chains. If this is the first time you found this channel, the link below goes to another story in the same universe. The one about what happened the first time a Vihari delegation arrived on Earth and encountered something they had absolutely no framework for. Human music. Stick around. There's a lot more where this came from. And if you got something from this story, if it landed somewhere, hit that button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and I'll see you in the next one.